The New York City subway system is a scary place. I've been an MTA worker for 7 years, and nothing really surprises me anymore. When friends and family ask if I have any stories, though, there is one that stands out among the rest, one that I can't explain. This happened to me about 2 years into the job, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I was pretty acclimated to everything at that point, and things had become routine. I was stationed in Brooklyn at the time, and I was doing some routine maintenance in High Street Station. There wasn't a soul on the platform. It was actually kind of eerie. You're used to these subway stations overflowing with people, so seeing them empty and almost deserted looking was a strange adjustment to make. I hadn't seen a person on the platform in hours, and it was dead silent except for the buzz of the lights and the occasional passing train. Out of nowhere, I heard a clang from somewhere down the track. It startled me so badly that I dropped my mop in shock. The sound wasn't something I was used to hearing. The best way I could describe it to you is that sound that a rock would make if it had been dropped on a metal rail. I stopped what I was doing and looked into the tunnel, listening for other noises. After a while, I concluded that whatever I heard had either been caused by an animal or a falling piece of cement. After all, these stations were pretty old. I went back to work, not thinking too much about the sound. About 10 minutes later, the same sound shook me from my concentration. Only this time, it was probably about twice as loud. This time, I actually became a little concerned, dare I say, scared. Was it really possible that 2 chunks of the ceiling had fallen in the span of 10 minutes? I put down my supplies and walked over to the tunnel entrance, trying to be quiet. I peered into the darkness and couldn't really see anything. I debated whether or not it was a good idea to call out into the tunnel and ultimately decided against it. I still figured it was nothing, but after the initial fear had worn off, I was more confused than anything. I kept trying to think of things that could make a sound like that, not once, but twice. It was especially bizarre since the second sound was louder. I tried to keep my mind off the sounds and went back to work, finding a good rhythm again. I was almost done with my work on this platform and was pleased that I'd get to leave this weird station soon. As I was wrapping things up, I heard something that gave me the chills. A child's voice called out for help from inside the tunnel, and he sounded like he was in distress. I instantly stopped what I was doing and made my way over to the edge of the platform. I hesitated for a few seconds before deciding that a child in anguish wasn't something my moral conscience would allow me to ignore. I walked down the steps leading onto the tracks and waited for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. I shouted into the tunnel, asking the kid if he was okay. No response. That's weird, I thought, starting to feel nervous about this encounter. Just then, the kid's voice rang out again, repeating his call for help. I yelled back, asking him if he could hear me. He responded, yes, and I asked where specifically he was. There was a brief moment of silence before he just said, in front of you. Just keep walking. I really didn't want to, but couldn't just leave some helpless kid all alone on those tracks. It was dangerous. I began walking forward when something dawned on me. I yelled into the darkness one more time, this time asking the kid what was wrong. An uncomfortable pause again before the kid responded, just keep walking. I didn't like that. This whole thing was off. My eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, and I was able to slightly make out what was in front of me. There actually was what looked like the shadow of a kid just up the tracks, but there was something else that almost made me scream in fear, another shadow, this one much taller, obviously an adult. My blood ran cold, and I stopped in place. This wasn't happening to me. As slowly as I could, I turned around and made my way back to the platform. Luckily, I wasn't chased on the way back. The kid shouted, "Wait, where are you going?" once I reached the platform, but I wasn't sticking around another second. I made my way up the stairs and called the police as soon as I got cell service. I told them everything, and police were swarming the platform in a matter of minutes. I waited to see what they turned up. After about 30 minutes of searching, they did find something chilling. There was a single kid shoe just lying in the tunnel, which the police hypothesized could have signified a struggle. After hours more of searching and scouring every available database for missing children, we were told we'd receive a call if anything ever came up. It was concluded that whoever had been down there, though, had hidden somewhere in the tunnels. I have no idea what to think of this experience. This is the best theory I can come up with. Some psycho kidnapped a child and forced him to yell for help in an attempt to lure some unsuspecting Good Samaritan into a trap. Or hell, maybe it's their own kid who they're raising to also be a psycho. I can't think of any other reasonable explanation besides this one. But if I'm right, I can only imagine what that kid must be going through. I come from a small town in Pennsylvania, and I've lived here all of my life. I'm 17 years old, and the time this story took place, I was around 14 years old. My memory around this is a little hazy because I don't like to talk about it, but I figured I'd let out any dark feelings I still get by it. It may not be considered a scary story, but to me, this was probably one of the most scariest things that I've ever been through. At the time this happened, I was an 8th grader in middle school. During the time, my mom worked at Panera Bread, and she had to work very early in the morning, so me and my sister would usually take the bus to school while my dad and my little brother, who was around 4 years old at the time, would stay home. This will be important later. It was like any other ordinary day. Me and my sister would get ready and leave at around 7:20 a.m. to walk to our bus stop. We lived in an apartment complex, and we would have to walk the 3 minutes to the front of the apartment because that's where the bus would pick us up. A little background information: me and my sister would meet up with our friends at the bus stop since we lived in the same apartment complex, and we would wait until the bus showed up. I would stay at the back with my friend, while my sister and her friend would be towards the front, 5 feet from the stop. So, like our usual routine, I had met up with my friend, Reed, and my sister would meet up with her friend, who I'll call Lelia. We waited for the bus to show up. Me and Reed would always see this boy, who I'll refer to as Scott. He was a year younger than us, and he would always run across the street to our bus stop to get a seat since we would be the first to be picked up. This was because by the time the bus driver would pick him up, he'd be the last person, and there would be no seats left for him to sit at. So he began to run across the street, and we were used to seeing him run across like that. Reed and I would always laugh at the way he ran, but wouldn't pay any more attention after he made it across. This will also be important. So, as we're waiting for the bus to arrive, me and my friend were talking, and there would be 5 other kids waiting for the bus at the front of the apartments as well. And like always, we see Scott across the street, waiting for the bus to arrive. A few minutes go by, and we see the yellow bus coming towards our stop. So everyone on our side begins to gather their belongings, and we begin to form a line as the bus gets closer. It begins to blink its lights, and the stop sign starts to come out at the side, as a sign for the other cars to stop. And for just a second, I begin to see Scott running across. I don't give it 2 thoughts since this was normal, and I began to hear the screeching noise coming from the opposite side of the road. It was like everything was going in slow motion during those couple of seconds, and I remember hearing the screeching noise become louder and louder. As I'm picking up my head to see what the noise was, I heard a big thump noise, and what I saw next will forever remain in my mind until this day. I hear a big thump noise, and I then see Scott flying in the air. I then see Scott hitting the ground so hard, and the noise was so loud as he then made an impact to the street. I remember hearing my friend Reed then scream at the top of her lungs, and I then quickly looked at the car, and I saw the driver inside. I remember seeing the bus driver quickly taking out his walkie-talkie attached to his radio as he was then saying all these codes into it. I then see Scott running around the bus and towards where our bus stop was, and he then had his arms wrapped around his stomach, and he was bleeding all around his head. He also had these cuts on his face, and he was crying wildly. During that moment, I was so horrified that I froze, and I was so scared to say anything. The driver then came out of the car and began to panic, then sang to Scott, "Oh my God, man, I'm so sorry. I never even saw you." I was looking down for 1 second, and then it just happened. But Scott was in so much pain, then he didn't even pay attention to him. Then this kid in my sister's grade ran up to him, then sang, "Hey, man, do you need an ambulance?" Scott was just crying, then shaking his head yes. The boy then took out his phone and called 911, telling the operator everything that happened. The driver then fell to the ground, took a cell phone out, and began to call someone. He then put it on speaker, and once the person picked up and said hello, he'd been sad, "Mom," to the kid, "So sorry." And he then began to break down in tears, and he just kept repeating that same line over and over again. The driver's mother had tried to calm him down, and then the driver just said, "Please forgive me, please. And even my car, it's a friend's car." Scott just stayed on the ground, lying there, as everyone watched him. The next thing I remember was that Scott always had his mother and brother take him to the bus stop, and they would always make sure he got on, but on this day, they never went with him to the bus stop. I then began to check on my sister, making sure she was okay. Her and her friends seemed a little shaken up, but they were okay. Reed's mom and sister were running up to us, and I remember hugging them. At that moment, I felt so alone and horrified. I began to cry hysterically, and my sister was just trying to comfort me. Something that I always regret was never telling my parents right away about what happened. I didn't want to wake and worry my dad, and I didn't want to get my mom in trouble for leaving early. I knew that she suffered from anxiety, so I didn't want to give her a panic attack, which she would get every once in a while. So, my sister and I just decided to wait there. I remember calling my friend, who I'll call Kara. I remember that her and her mom worked at the school next to ours, and I began to tell her everything that happened. I began to break down. They quickly alerted the front desk, and she calmed me down, telling me everything was going to be okay. I know some of you might be thinking, how was I able to call my friend but not my parents? But during that moment, I just felt the need to call Cindy because she was who I trusted at the time, and we're still friends to this day. About 20 minutes later, the ambulance arrived. They began to check Scott and treat him while he was lying on the ground, still crying and in pain. 10 minutes passed, and I began to come at ease. They started to place him on the stretcher. I remember seeing his mom and brother running with a paramedic towards him, and they had the most worried and horrified faces that I've ever seen. I began to feel so sad for them. Reed, my sister, and I thought it would be okay if we went to school just to try and take our minds off of everything that happened and all of the horror we witnessed 40 minutes ago. We were at our bus stop for almost an hour, and we still got picked up at the next stop and then immediately went to school. I remember the staff waiting there for us and separating the apartment complex bus stop kids, escorting us to the library. I won't go into too much detail, but they pretty much stated that we could stop by the counselor's office anytime during the school day, and if we wanted to leave school, we were able to. After that event, I didn't take the bus for 4 months and was dropped off. I didn't want to cross the street, and whenever I would hear a tire screech, I would always jump and begin to get a cold sweat. A few months later, I began to feel better and continued to live a normal life. After that, Scott didn't go to school until months later, until he was finally okay, towards the end of the year. Like I said, I know this wasn't the typical stalker story, but this was one horrific event that I went through, and I never want to go through it again. But remember to stay safe out there. I really hope many people don't ever have to witness what I and the other kids had to see that day. It was truly awful. My name is Valor. I'm 24 years old, and this was the most horrifying experience of my life. I live and work in New York City, but I don't have a car, so my main mode of transportation is the subway. It was a Saturday night. I was on my way home from a party in the middle of the night. I did this about every other weekend, so I was completely fine with taking the subway alone at night. Walking down the steps, entering the underground without a soul in sight, it was always a bit chilling. This specific station was very tightly spaced. As I was walking, I could almost feel as if I were being watched or followed, along with the occasional echoing bang-type sound emitting from an unknown location. I was early for the train, so I sat on a bench and waited. This is something straight out of a horror movie. I heard this exact phrase, "Over here, buddy." There was somebody standing on the tracks inside the tunnel, poking his head out and looking at me. It was a filthy-looking man, I'd say in his early 40s. He gave me a smile, a horrible yellow smile with at least 3 teeth missing, and I could tell that even from where I was sitting. I did the best I could to pay no attention to him, but he wouldn't go away. There was laughing coming from inside the tunnel, and then another disgusting-looking man stuck his face out as well. This man gave me a nasty smile as well before telling me to come hang out with them in the tunnel. The way they stared at me, though, their eyes wouldn't even move, it's as if their sight was locked onto me. I resumed doing the best I could to ignore them and just wait for the train. I noticed in my peripheral vision that one of the men moved away into the tunnel, returning moments later with another face. I had to look again. There was a third face, but this one was hunched over and lifeless. It looked like one of the men was holding the guy's face up. The sound of the train approaching felt like 1,000 pounds off my shoulders. I got up, ready to board the train, but when I got closer to the edge of the platform, I nearly threw up at the sight. The 2 men were going back into the tunnel, and the second man in the back was holding something in his hand, a head, just a head, like a decapitated head. They disappeared from sight onto the side of the tunnel as the train stopped. I got into the first car, planning on warning the conductor, but no later than after we left the station. I didn't want to be there a second longer. As the train began to move, I saw legs moving down the stairs to the platform, but that was it. I didn't get to see who it was. But what I did get to see as the train moved into the tunnels was a glimpse of a group of men hunched up against the railing, inches away from the train window, and they were all looking right at me. I knocked on the conductor's door like a madman, screaming it was an emergency. He opened up, and I explained what I just saw. He radioed to somebody in charge of the station as well as another higher-up of the company, who I'm sure took care of it or contacted the proper authorities or security, whatever. It seemed to take ages for my stop to come, but when it did, I practically had to hop in my walk from relief. I have since been to one party at the same friend's house, but I skipped that station. I decided it was worth it to take the extra long walk to the next station. I don't know if weird shit happens often in the subway at night. In my experience prior to this incident, it never did. But after this experience, I think I should say you should be extremely cautious when in an isolated place like a subway station late at night. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to watch the latest videos.